Hello everyone, I hope today finds you well. I'm the introverted astrologer and I'm delighted to be back today with my take on the United States for the rest of 2024. We're going to be using some specific techniques that belong to a branch of astrology called mundane astrology, and we'll be looking at the states month on month, leading right through to your presidential elections and to December and perhaps a little bit beyond too. I felt this was an important video to make because the United States will be experiencing a progressed new moon occurring in the United States chart. This means that the progressed moon is drawing close to a conjunction with the progressed sun. This is a lengthy cycle taking some 29-30 years to draw to a close and begin again. And the United States is on the brink of this. And if we add to the melting pot a few strong eclipses this year and an unusual election period, then we have a few things to talk about. So let's go to the computer and unpick this a bit more. Now we'll start off by taking a look at the natal chart of the United States. We're using the Sibley chart and we're kicking off from the time when America's progressed moon becomes exactly conjunct with the progressed sun. So we're looking at a period in late March, and that ties in nicely with the springtime lunar eclipse too. So this video is looking at America from late March through to the end of 2024. I'll draw your attention to that progressed sun and moon coming together at the bottom of the chart. This heralds the gradual closing down of an old cycle which has spanned some 3 decades and the gradual beginning of a new one. To place this into context, America's last progressed new moon took place around October 1994. This would have been a time when Bill Clinton was in power, and that new moon took place against the backdrop of an Aquarius sign placement. And we could view those Aquarian themes of social reform, of humanitarian goals, of change and innovation, but possibly also disruption. This new cycle begins against the backdrop of a Pisces sign. We do associate Pisces with spirituality, but it also has less positive connotations too. So we could look at drift, confusion, dissolution. And if we look to the chart on the right, which is the progressed chart of the United States on its own, you can see that new moon being loosely aspected with a trine to Jupiter, possibly representing that hope, humanitarian goals, social betterment, and at the same time opposing Neptune, so potentially confusion, delusion, and an inconjunct to Mars, possibly showing an uneasy relationship with conflict, aggression, and the use of national power. Now, when we have a progressed moon taking place in a chart, the exact moment that the sun and moon become exact is not necessarily of great impact. These are lengthy cycles, and it is therefore more useful to look at the preceding 3 to 4 years before the exact conjunction in the progressions. That preceding 3 or 4 years is often a time when our world shrinks. Dreams, hopes, support systems may all seem to shrink and disappear. It can be viewed in a way as a winter of discontent. At the time of the exact conjunction and the ensuing 3 to 4 years are a time of new seeds. There may be a sense that something is drawing to a close and ending, and that new beginnings or seeds will gradually come in, take hold and fill that vacuum. As that progressed moon travels away from the progressed Sun and slowly moves through the remaining degrees of Pisces, it will kick off certain aspects, and these are important. As we draw closer to May of 2024, the progressed Moon is going to square America's natal Mars. This could be a time of conflict and anger for the United States, and we'll make a note of that. I should also add that the progressed Moon is travelling through the United States' 4th house. This is the house that represents the people, democracy for what it's worth. It can also signify women, and other significations could be land and buildings, crops, agriculture. But the general people of the land, us ordinary folk, this is what the progressed Moon is illuminating while it travels through the remaining degrees of Pisces, which will encompass most of 2024. And no sooner has this progressed Moon gone on to square Mars, when it goes on to oppose the United States Neptune, indicating a time of some confusion. If we take note that Neptune is in the 10th house of government and rulers, then if the progressed Moon is opposing Neptune, not only may there be confusion around the state of the country and its government, but there may even be that potential for the wool to be pulled over the people's eyes. This is not a time of clarity, and the full facts of this time may not be known until the aspect has completed. It becomes exact in early June. If we allow a degree of orb, the influence of this aspect will not be over until we're in July, and perhaps at this time there will be a greater understanding of what has taken place. In fact, a trine to natal Mercury later in July will coincide with a period of greater elucidation. We would expect greater communication, an emphasis on political meetings and debate, more public speaking, and perhaps some importance relating to commercial dealings. As we move into October 2024, that progressed Moon forms a helpful aspect with natal Pluto. Because Pluto is in the 2nd house of resources and income, perhaps there is hope or opportunity at this time to see modest improvements in issues like take-home pay. That progressed Moon changes sign. It moves into the sign of Aries, which is incisive, bold, courageous, determined, and it also moves into the 5th house. It will stay in that 5th house for a good couple of years, and it changes the emphasis onto something more hopeful and vibrant. Matters relating to entertainment, recreation, social activities, children, schools will come more to the forefront. Another interesting progression that you may have noticed is that the progressed midheaven of the United States is drawing closer to progressed Uranus. The midheaven represents power, authority, governments, presidents, and Uranus, of course, brings change, innovation, disruption. Now, it will be some time before the progressed midheaven of the United States, which is around 7 degrees of Gemini, exactly conjuncts that natal Uranus too. To put this into context for you, that progressed midheaven moves forward by just under a degree every year. Its starting position in the independence chart was around a degree of Libra. And so this is the first time that that progressed midheaven will make this conjunction. It's taken over 200 years for the progressed midheaven to edge forwards, travelling through the chart to arrive at this position. And it heralds potentially great change. Will we see political change, a shake-up to the United States international partnerships? But to be certain, the next couple of years is looking very changeful. Now, the transiting planets in 2024 will have some impact on the United States chart. If I draw your attention to Jupiter and Uranus, which are currently in the 6th house of the nation's health, working practices, and also national service, because the 6th house is the house of service. Well, we can see that Uranus transiting through this house is going to square the moon later in 2024. This could be tied up with changes and innovation to a health system, and that square aspect to the moon, which is the people, the general population, and democracy itself. This connection is going to bring some element of upset, shock, disruption. It may not be altogether welcome. And the first point at which this aspect becomes exact is later in August of 2024. It makes a less impactful aspect to natal Mercury, which will probably become evident around late May, early June. Perhaps there will be news released at this time, communications of innovation to health or working practices. It could be that news relating to an important medical breakthrough comes to light at this time. Most of us are aware that we have an impending Uranus-Jupiter conjunction coming this year, and in the United States chart, this conjunction takes place in that 6th house of health, working practices, employee-employer relations, and perhaps we'll know more about this in April/May. We should also briefly consider that transiting Pluto has moved away from the conjunction to its natal position, which is in the 2nd house, and it's moved into the 3rd house of Aquarius, but it will return again into that last degree of Capricorn later this year. Now, Pluto represents power, big business, corporate interests, and the 2nd house is a nation's wealth, its stock market, its assets. And I think it's fair to say that the preceding decade or so has seen an increasing emphasis on material corporate interests, the promotion of digital currency. But as Pluto moves into the 3rd house, it begins to trine the United States midheaven, and this year and next year could see some slow, ongoing but deep transformation of the government. Now, transiting Saturn is moving through Pisces this year, and as it does so, it is going to square the natal ascendant of the United States. It's moving through the 4th house of the people, of democracy, of land buildings and agriculture. And so perhaps this will mark a time when people are feeling downtrodden. It could be that agriculture, crops and the produce we need is in shorter supply. Saturn also rules the 2nd house, so perhaps money too will feel harder to come by. Let's move on now and consider the ingress and eclipse charts that affect the United States this year. Now, one of the traditional ways for forecasting with mundane charts is to draw up a series of ingress charts. These are the points in the year that roughly correlate with the equinoxes and solstices. And tradition has it that the first chart of the year, when the sun enters Aries, will dominate the year if the ascendant is in a fixed sign. So on the left you can see the Aries ingress chart for the United States, the point at which the sun is at 0 degrees 0 of Aries. The ascendant is in the sign of Scorpio, which is of course a fixed sign. And so this chart is extremely important when looking at the year ahead until March 2025. We will briefly consider the ingress charts for Cancer and Libra later in this video, but for now let's focus on that Aries ingress chart and consider the most striking aspects that are being made. On the surface of it, the sun, which represents rulers and government, is placed in the 6th house. So we know that matters relating to public health, work relations, employer-employee relations, working practices may take on significance this year. And there is a trine to that moon representing people and democracy in the 10th house. But that moon is being closely opposed by Pluto. Pluto is in the 4th house of the people. And this introduces an element of insecurity, of instability. Perhaps a feeling that the people are being coerced to bow down to greater power in unwelcome ways. And that 4th house of the people, of the land and democracy has Mars in it too. And that Mars is not well aspected. It squares Uranus, which speaks of change and chaos, possibly of riot or uprising. And we can also consider that Pluto and Mars are in the sign of the land. Are we seeing a potential for disruption of the land and all that it produces by way of crops? Will drought and famine be a feature of 2024? Let's see how this ingress chart relates to the United States natal chart. If we turn to the chart on the right, are there any important contacts being made? The natal planets of the United States are placed around in the outer ring, and the centre chart is the ingress chart. And in this relationship, we can see an important conjunction being made. The moon, the American everyday people, democracy, the land, is actually conjunct the ingress Mars. And it's a very close conjunction, so we know this is important. The feeling is one of anger. And we can also see some friction being aroused in the 6th house. Whatever changes may be introduced this year in the area of public health, of medicine, of innovation, changing working practices, it isn't necessarily going to be overwhelmingly welcomed, as evidenced by the Saturn opposition from the 12th house. Let's move on to have a look at the spring eclipses and see if they give us more information. We kick off with a lunar eclipse on the 25th of March. This will have a less dramatic impact, but will be closely followed by a solar eclipse on the 8th of April. In mundane astrology, eclipses are generally considered to have an unfortunate effect on a country, and particularly if the eclipse is visible in the country and takes some time to complete, then the effect is considered to be quite long-lasting, possibly playing out over months rather than weeks. Both of the charts that you can see are the moments that the eclipse becomes exact over Washington, and the American natal planets are placed around in the outer ring in red. Let's see if we can pick up any important connections and overlaps which will give us more information. And we can pretty quickly establish that the lunar eclipse, which is happening at around 5 degrees of Libra, is conjunct America's midheaven. And it's also going to quite closely square America's Jupiter and Venus conjunction in Cancer. So certainly, yes, we would anticipate an impact from this eclipse. We would anticipate some change in government policy, possibly foreign policy. And I can't help noticing that the moon, significant of democracy and America's ordinary people, is nearby the eclipse Mars. But let's move over to the solar eclipse, which is likely to have a far bigger impact. Are there any important interconnections being made? This eclipse takes place at around 19 degrees of Aries, and so it falls exactly on the Chiron in the United States chart. The States is currently undergoing a Chiron return to its natal position, so we know it's important anyway. And for an eclipse to land on it kickstarts that whole dynamic, and we can consider various symbolisms here. In a mundane chart, the 5th house covers topics like recreation, sport, children, schools. And so something within those areas is going to be brought to prominence. And this could be related to pain, wounding, or suffering of some sort. There's a wide opposition to America's natal Saturn. And so this could literally be a sadness or a sorrow that comes to pass shortly after the eclipse. The next chart we'll briefly consider as 2024 continues unfolding is the Cancer Ingress chart. This is dated for the 20th of June, the point at which the Sun enters into the very first minute of Cancer. This could have some bearing on the next 3 months, and we're looking for repeating themes that we've already identified in the Aries Ingress chart and the eclipses. What is being brought to prominence now? Again, we have America's natal planets arranged around the outside of this ring in red, and the most striking connection I can immediately see is that the moon in this ingress chart, the people, the land and democracy, is conjunct America's natal ascendant, the most sensitive point of the chart. And because I'm keeping my eyes on relationships between Mars and the moon during 2024, I'd also point out that that moon is opposing the midpoint of America's Uranus and Mars. It's also widely opposite both of them. And so we haven't lost the edge yet of potential anger, opposition, conflict and disruption. We can see America's natal moon making a square aspect to the ingress Uranus, re-emphasising that unsettled feeling. Now, the two ingress charts that we've considered so far this year both have a Scorpio ascendant. So we know that deep and transformational matters are dominating March through to September for the United States. And in this chart, if we consider the rulers of Scorpio, which are Pluto and Mars, they are in a square to each other. And this is a particularly determined and ruthless aspect, sometimes even involving explosiveness and violence. Whilst violence may not actually happen, it isn't an aspect for peace. But on a lighter note, we can see that the Venus in this ingress chart is closely conjunct to America's own Venus and its Jupiter. This is a highly favourable aspect. It brings together the benefics of both charts, and here it falls in the 9th house. The 9th house is very important for issues like legislation, religion, and perhaps we could see some important legislation passed which benefits women. In America's natal chart, Cancer rules the 8th house, perhaps bringing a positive uplift to 8th house matters such as the taxation system, the revenue of United States, or perhaps America's financial relationships with other countries. And so we now have a look at the Libra Ingress, which takes place on the 22nd of September. And again, the planets of the United States natal chart are placed around the outside of the ingress chart. What would we consider prominent here? We can disregard the Sun on America's midheaven because the Libra Ingress will always place the Sun on America's midheaven. But the midheaven of the ingress chart is quite closely conjunct to America's Mercury. And this brings to the forefront issues including communication and debate, of course, but possibly also the speaker. Issues of trade and commerce. Is Mercury significant? Yes, I would say so, because if we look at the Mercury in the ingress chart, we can see that it is conjunct to America's natal Neptune, and it squares Jupiter. So this could be a 3-month period when communication is extremely important, but is not necessarily as clear, concise and transparent as would be hoped. The Ingress chart also features a grand trine with Uranus conjunct Moon, trining Pluto and Mercury. The Ingress Mercury also squares America's natal Mars, so we can see that there is considerable and potentially heated communications, and with America's Mars conjunct that Jupiter, there could be important principles at stake here. The Mars in this Ingress chart is not happy in the position of Cancer, and it is closely conjuncting the American Sun. We can see a steadying trine to transiting Saturn, which will hopefully help contain and streamline this excess of energy and conflict in a useful, instrumental way. And the ascendant of this Ingress chart is placed in Libra. The American Chiron is therefore conjunct the descendant, so it's unclear whether it will bring a period of more calm and sensitive international relations, or whether relationships abroad will indeed be a great sore point. We'll have a quick look at the new moons that take place during 2024 to see if some months are more troubled than others. So you'll notice that the new moons for April and for October are missing, and that is, of course, because we have covered those. They were actually eclipses. At the time of recording, America will soon be experiencing a new moon that takes place on the 10th of March. I'll just quickly point out that that's quite a tricky new moon. It's taking place at around 20 degrees of Pisces, and so it is going to square the Mars in America's natal mundane chart, and it will simultaneously oppose the Neptune in the United States chart. Will this be a month when we begin to see increased friction with our international partners or our open enemies? And will we be handling this transparently, or is there going to be a degree of underhandedness? We'll have to wait and see. We'll work through these new moons quickly because of the amount of information to take in during this video. We're really looking at just the essence of the new moon, notable new moon aspects, and whether these connect with prominent parts of the United States natal chart. Now, the new moon in May falls in America's 6th house. So this is all concerned with health matters, with work relationships. And the essence of this new moon is one of innovation and breakthrough, because we have Uranus and Jupiter as part of the Sun-Moon conjunction. The new moon position widely squares America's natal moon. And so we may see reform or innovation in these 6th house matters that is not altogether welcomed by the American people. June's new moon takes place in the sign of Gemini. So this is lighting up America's 7th house of international relationships, both friendly and those with open enemies. The Sun, Moon and Venus are all tightly conjunct at around 16 degrees of Gemini, and they square transiting Saturn in Pisces. This conjunction falls rather near America's natal Mars, which is of course in a square aspect with Neptune. I wonder if we could see some major changes or adjustments to foreign policy, and whether there will be friction and aggression involved in this too, because of that conjunction to America's Mars. Venus is actually conjunct the new moon, so there is a potential there for fortunate relationships with other countries, and America's natal Saturn trines this new moon, so perhaps some good will come of this too. But it looks like an intense month for international diplomacy. July's new moon falls at 14 degrees of Cancer. This means that it is also illuminating that natal square between Sun and Saturn. This is the 8th house. It's the place of taxation, death rates. It can sometimes be the death of a very important person, precisely because this new moon does square America's Saturn. There is potentially problems that could arise in relation to America's resources that it brings in from other countries. The August new moon illuminates America's 9th house. And so we're looking at 9th house topics such as the law, science, universities, inventions, religion. This new moon isn't particularly badly aspected. There are a few minor overlaps. So, for example, the Mars in the new moon chart is conjunct America's natal Uranus. So we can still feel an inherent tension there, but overall it's one of the easier new moons. September's new moon falls into the 10th house of the United States. This is the house of power, of the president, or of very important people. This new moon is in opposition to transiting Saturn, but it also squares America's natal Uranus. And this square suggests quite an abrupt change. Will there be disruption or change around a major government figure or authority figure? It will be interesting to see how this plays out between the 2nd of September and early October. The November new moon takes place on the 1st of November, and this is just 4 days before we're anticipating the presidential election. The new moon itself is not particularly difficult. There's a steadying trine to Saturn, and very little by way of difficult aspects to America's natal chart. In fact, the new moon trines America's Venus and Jupiter, and also its Sun. I will point out that in the November new moon chart, we're beginning to see the first opposition between Pluto and Mars. Many of you will be aware that Mars will be moving through the sign of Cancer, and it will be slowing down as it is about to turn retrograde in the early degrees of Leo. In this whole Mars retrograde journey, it will make 3 oppositions to Pluto. The fact that Mars is in a sign in which it is inherently unhappy, i.e. Cancer, means that this is an important opposition. And so in a future video I will focus exclusively on how the United States is likely to experience this Mars retrograde journey, because it will pick off a variety of planets in the United States' 8th house, and that will be important. And finally, we have a look at December's new moon. This new moon is lighting up America's 1st house. In fact, it's conjunct the ascendant. There is some change woven into this, in that the new moon will be squaring, transiting Saturn, and it is going to make an opposition to America's natal Uranus. So we know that there's some change and some tension here, perhaps a setting aside of old conditions. The ascendant of a main chart describes the general appearance of a country, its people and their characteristics, its general state of health and the shape of its finances. Does this mark the introduction of a new leader who begins discussing the changes that they are inclined to make before their inauguration next month? Now, we've discussed quite a lot in this video and looked at a variety of sources. I'll set out some of the main themes we identified in one place. I'm aware that the Moon, Mars and Uranus have cropped up quite a lot during this video, and I think yet again we find ourselves at a rather tense place in world history. Prominent issues at the moment include the Ukraine-Russia conflict. We have rising tension in the Middle East, and the early stages of conflict are already there. World weather patterns, global warming, crop production, the cost of living are common topics in many countries, and friction relating to immigration and the funding of other countries and other conflicts are all taking increasing prominence. But do I think that the American people will be given more than they can cope with this year? No, I don't. America has actually experienced more difficult years in the last couple of decades. And if you take a look at the American chart and its representation of the American people, we can see that we have that placement in Aquarius. This represents people who are staunch, resilient, broad-minded and future-oriented, and I believe they will prevail. I'm sure there'll be many things I've missed in this video because it covers such a large time span. Please do feel free to add your own comments, things that you identify as part of this big picture for 2024. So, I hope this video has given you food for thought. I was very aware whilst I was making it that many of the interpretations that are used in mundane astrology can be quite negative. And so, for example, eclipses are still seen as bringing trouble and misfortune when they affect a mundane chart. So if the interpretations have at times seemed to err on the side of negativity, discord or dissent, this does not mean that your year has to be filled with those flavours. And in fact, those of you who will be affected by the first eclipses of the year, taking place across March and April, this is a positive eclipse family, and you have good reason to look forward to it. Until next time, do take good care of yourselves.